A chance encounter at the market. The sun had barely reached its peak, casting warm golden rays over the bustling outdoor market. Vendors shouted their prices, eager to attract customers, while the scent of fresh produce, spices, and sizzling street food filled the air. Shoppers weaved in and out of the crowded lanes, their arms full of bags, haggling over prices and exchanging friendly banter with familiar stall owners. Amidst the noise and movement, one small figure stood still, captivated by something no one else seemed to notice. Lena Carter, a curious and kind-hearted 5-year-old, clung to her mother's hand as they made their way through the market. She had always loved animals, something her mother, Isabel, had recognized from the time Lena could barely walk. Whether it was stray cats wandering their neighborhood, birds nesting in their backyard, or even the tiniest insects crawling on the sidewalk, Lena treated each creature with the same gentle fascination. As they moved past a stall overflowing with bright oranges and ripe mangoes, Lena's gaze was drawn to a shadowy corner where a large German shepherd was tethered to a wooden post. His fur was dirty and matted, his ribs faintly visible beneath his coat. He sat silently, his dark eyes scanning the passing crowd, though no one paid him any attention. To Lena, he looked profoundly sad, as if he had long given up hope of ever being noticed, let alone loved. "Mommy, look," Lena whispered, tugging Isabel's hand and pointing toward the dog. Isabel turned her head, following her daughter's line of sight. A quiet sigh escaped her lips as she immediately understood what had captured Lena's attention. Her daughter had always been drawn to animals in distress, and this time was no different. Isabel had hoped they could finish their shopping without any detours, but she saw the earnest concern in Lena's eyes. "Okay, sweetheart." Isabel relented with a soft smile. "We can go take a look, but stay close to me, all right?" With cautious steps, Lena approached the dog. She crouched a few feet away, careful not to startle him, and extended her small hand in his direction. "Hi there, boy," she murmured softly. The German shepherd lifted his head slightly, his ears twitching at the sound of her voice. His dark eyes met hers, filled with quiet curiosity, but also hesitation. He sniffed the air cautiously, his body tense, as if unsure whether to trust the tiny human in front of him. "You look so sad," Lena whispered, inching a little closer. "It's okay. I'm here now." Isabel watched intently, her protective instincts kicking in. The dog was large, and despite his current condition, he still possessed an air of strength. She worried he might react unpredictably, but something about the moment between her daughter and the dog felt different. Lena had always had a way with animals, and Isabel could see the first sparks of an unspoken bond forming between them. "Lena, be careful," Isabel cautioned gently. "He might be scared." Lena nodded, her focus never wavering. She noticed a man behind a nearby stall who seemed to be the dog's owner. He was busy weighing vegetables and bagging them for customers, barely acknowledging the dog's presence. Lena stood up and approached the vendor with determination. "Excuse me, sir," she said, her voice polite yet firm. "Is this your dog?" The vendor barely spared her a glance, nodding dismissively. "Yeah, he's mine." Lena frowned. "Why does he look so sad?" The man sighed, clearly uninterested in the conversation. "Because he's useless," he muttered. "No one wants him. He just takes up space." Lena's heart clenched. She looked back at the dog, who still sat quietly, his eyes watching her. He didn't bark, didn't whimper. He simply observed, as if he had already learned that no amount of noise would change his fate. "Can I pet him?" Lena asked. The vendor shrugged carelessly. "Do whatever you want, kid. Doesn't make a difference to me." Lena turned back toward the dog, carefully kneeling beside him and extending her hand once more. This time, he didn't pull away. Slowly, he lowered his head and sniffed her tiny fingers before pressing his nose against her palm. A tiny wag of his tail followed, a barely noticeable gesture. But to Lena, it meant everything. "You're not useless," she whispered as she gently ran her fingers through his coarse fur. "You're just waiting for someone to see you." Isabel felt a lump form in her throat at the sight of her daughter's unwavering kindness. She glanced back at the vendor, who was now entirely focused on his customers, uninterested in the interaction happening just a few feet away. A decision formed in her mind, one she knew would change everything. She knelt beside Lena and placed a hand on her daughter's shoulder. "What do you think, sweetheart?" she asked softly. Lena turned to her mother, hope shining in her eyes. "Can we help him, Mommy?" Isabel hesitated for only a moment before nodding. "Let's see what we can do." Lena beamed, turning her attention back to the dog, who had now rested his head against her knee, letting out a quiet sigh. She knew, somehow, that this was the beginning of something special. Neither she nor Isabel could have predicted just how much this dog, whom Lena would soon name Max, would change their lives forever. Scene 2. The journey to rescue Max. For the next few weeks, every Saturday morning, little Sophie, accompanied by her parents Rachel and Daniel, made her way through the lively, chaotic marketplace. The scent of freshly baked bread mixed with the sharp aroma of spices and the chatter of vendors filled the air. However, Sophie's mind was always focused on one thing: the large German shepherd she had found tied near a vendor's stall. From the first moment she laid eyes on him, Max, as she had decided to call him, had captured her heart. His sad, weary eyes told a story of loneliness, neglect, and resignation. He had barely reacted when she first crouched near him and whispered gentle words. But over time, something had begun to change, a growing bond. Each time Sophie returned to the market, she made sure to stop by Max's spot. She would crouch next to him, talk softly, and stroke his matted fur. At first, he had been hesitant, barely acknowledging her presence. But soon, she noticed his eyes light up whenever she arrived. His tail, which once lay motionless against the dusty ground, started to wag ever so slightly. Her parents, though initially hesitant, watched in amazement. Rachel had always known Sophie had a way with animals. Even as a toddler, she had an uncanny ability to calm skittish dogs and befriend even the most aloof of cats. But Max was different. He wasn't just a stray. He had an owner, a vendor in the market, who showed little care for him. Confronting the vendor, one morning, Sophie decided to approach the man responsible for Max's well-being. The vendor, a gruff-looking man named Mr. Blake, was busy tending to customers when Sophie hesitantly stepped forward. "Excuse me, sir," she said, her small voice barely audible over the noise of the market. Mr. Blake barely spared her a glance. "What do you want, kid?" She pointed toward Max. "Is he your dog?" The man gave an indifferent nod. "Yeah, but he's no good, just takes up space." Sophie's heart sank. She couldn't understand how anyone could treat a living being with such coldness. "Can I pet him?" she asked, hoping for at least some goodwill. Mr. Blake shrugged carelessly. "Do whatever you want. Doesn't matter to me." That answer told Sophie everything she needed to know. This wasn't just neglect. This was a complete lack of care. To Mr. Blake, Max was nothing more than an inconvenience. Convincing her parents, Sophie turned back to her parents, her eyes pleading. "Mom, Dad, we can't leave him here. He's so sad." Rachel and Daniel exchanged a glance. They had already seen their daughter's growing attachment to Max, but taking in a dog, especially one in such poor condition, was a big responsibility. "Sophie," her father said gently, "we can't just take someone's dog." "But he doesn't even care about Max. He said so himself." Sophie's voice trembled with frustration. "Please, we have to help him." Rachel knelt beside her daughter and brushed a stray lock of hair behind her ear. "Honey, rescuing a dog isn't just about taking him home. He needs food, medical care, and patience." "I'll do everything," Sophie promised. "I'll take care of him, feed him, walk him. Please, just give him a chance." Rachel sighed, looking over at the dog, who now sat quietly, watching them with sad amber eyes. Daniel was already rubbing the back of his neck, deep in thought. "We need to think about it," he finally said. "But in the meantime, we can make sure he's okay." That was all Sophie needed to hear. It wasn't a yes, but it wasn't a no either. Earning Max's trust. From that day forward, Sophie and her parents made it a point to visit the market every weekend, bringing food and fresh water for Max. Slowly but surely, his demeanor started to change. The first time Sophie offered him a piece of chicken, he hesitated, eyeing her with uncertainty. But hunger won over fear, and he gently took the food from her hand. After that, he no longer pulled away when she reached out to pet him. He began leaning into her touch, his tail wagging a little more each time. The more Sophie visited, the more Max seemed to recognize her. His ears would perk up when he saw her approach, and he even let out small whines of excitement. One afternoon, something incredible happened. As Sophie knelt beside Max, gently stroking his fur, he did something he had never done before. He rested his head on her lap. Rachel and Daniel watched the moment unfold, and Rachel felt her heart squeeze. Sophie had always been gentle, patient, and full of love for animals. Seeing Max finally show trust in their daughter convinced her of what she already knew. Sophie had chosen him long before they had even considered it. The decision to bring him home, after weeks of caring for Max at the market, Rachel and Daniel knew they had a decision to make. They sat down one evening, discussing the possibilities. "He needs medical attention," Daniel said. "He's been neglected for who knows how long." "I know," Rachel agreed. "But Sophie's right. That man doesn't care about him, and it's clear Max already thinks of Sophie as his person." Daniel nodded. "We can do this, but it won't be easy." The next time they went to the market, they approached Mr. Blake. "How much for the dog?" Daniel asked, keeping his tone firm. Mr. Blake looked surprised. "You actually want him?" "Yes," Rachel said. "We want to take him home." The vendor let out a short laugh. "Take him. He's worthless to me." Sophie's eyes widened. "Really?" "Really," Mr. Blake said with a dismissive wave. "Less trouble for me." Sophie's heart soared. She rushed forward, carefully unchaining Max. "You're coming home with us," she whispered into his fur. As she led him toward the car, Max hesitated for a second, looking back at the life he was leaving behind. Then, as if understanding he was finally free, he trotted forward and rested his head against Sophie's side. A new beginning. The ride home was quiet. Max lay with his head on Sophie's lap, his breathing steady. Rachel turned to Daniel, who met her gaze with a small smile. "He's going to be okay," she murmured. Daniel nodded. "He's finally home." And as Sophie continued to stroke Max's fur, she whispered softly, "I promise, you'll never be unloved again." Little did she know, Max was about to change her life in ways she could never have imagined. Scene 3. The challenges of a new home. The ride home from the market had been filled with an air of excitement and quiet anticipation. Sophie, barely able to contain her joy, sat beside her new companion, gently stroking his fur as he rested his head on her lap. Max, however, remained silent, his deep brown eyes flickering with uncertainty. For the first time in his life, he was heading somewhere unknown, a place that could either offer warmth and safety or another round of disappointment. As they pulled into the driveway, Sophie eagerly unbuckled her seatbelt and jumped out of the car. Rachel and Daniel, her parents, exchanged glances before carefully opening the back door. "Come on, Max," Sophie cooed, crouching slightly and extending her hand. "It's okay, you're home now." Max hesitated. His ears twitched and his body remained tense. Despite the weeks of growing trust at the market, stepping into an entirely new world was terrifying. Rachel's voice was soft but reassuring. "Let's give him a moment." After a few beats, Max slowly stepped out, his nails clicking against the pavement as he cautiously sniffed the air. Sophie beamed and reached for his leash, guiding him toward the front porch. His movements were hesitant, his tail tucked slightly. Though his body wasn't rigid with fear, it was clear he didn't quite believe he belonged here yet, adjusting to a new environment. Once inside, Sophie eagerly showed Max around, her excitement bubbling over. "This is our living room, and here's the kitchen. Oh, and look, your bed is right here." A plush dog bed had been placed in a cozy corner with a bowl of fresh water beside it. However, Max barely seemed to notice. Instead, he remained close to the door, watching everything with wary eyes. Rachel set a bowl of food down, hoping to encourage him to relax. But Max didn't move. Sophie frowned. "Why isn't he eating?" Daniel sighed. "He's probably just overwhelmed. It might take him a little while to realize he's safe." Sophie crouched down beside him. "You are safe, Max. I promise." For the rest of the evening, Max wandered the house cautiously, never straying too far from the door. When Sophie sat on the floor, flipping through a picture book, he slowly crept closer and eventually lay beside her. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Signs of trauma. As the days passed, it became evident just how deeply Max's past had affected him. He flinched at sudden movements and shrank away whenever a loud noise filled the room. One morning, Rachel accidentally dropped a metal pan, and the sharp clang sent Max scurrying into the nearest corner, his ears flattened against his head. Sophie rushed to his side, gently placing a hand on his back. "It's okay, boy," she whispered. "It was just a noise." Rachel felt a pang of sadness as she watched them. Max had clearly been through so much. She had expected an adjustment period, but seeing him cower like this only confirmed how badly he had been mistreated. At night, instead of sleeping in the plush bed they had set up for him, Max would curl up near the door as if preparing for someone to shove him outside at any moment. He still doesn't trust that this is permanent. Daniel observed one evening as he watched Max settle into his usual spot. Rachel nodded. He needs time. But Sophie had already made up her mind. She wasn't going to let Max feel like an outsider in his own home. A child's unwavering love day by day, Sophie made it her mission to help Max feel comfortable. She would sit by his side for hours, reading him stories or simply talking to him about her day. At first, Max merely tolerated it. He would sit stiffly beside her, unmoving, but slowly he began to relax. He stopped tensing when she reached out to pet him. He started responding to his name. And then, one afternoon, something incredible happened. Sophie was drawing at the kitchen table, humming softly to herself. Max lay near the door, watching her as usual. Without thinking, she slid off her chair and sat cross-legged on the floor. She didn't say anything. She just sat. Minutes passed. Then, cautiously, Max lifted his head. He sniffed the air, then slowly, hesitantly crept forward. Rachel, who had been quietly observing from the other room, held her breath. Max finally reached Sophie, and with a heavy sigh, lowered his head onto her lap. Sophie froze, eyes wide with surprise. Then a huge smile spread across her face. She stroked his fur gently. "See? I told you, Max. You belong here." Progress and setbacks. Despite the heartwarming moment, Max's journey was far from over. While he had warmed up to Sophie, he remained distant from adults, particularly Daniel. He would often keep a careful distance, his eyes watching Daniel's every move. "I think he was mistreated by a man before," Rachel murmured one evening. "He's cautious around you in a way he isn't with Sophie or me." Daniel frowned. "I don't want to force anything. He needs to come around in his own time." They agreed to give Max the space he needed while continuing to reinforce that he was safe. There were also setbacks. Some nights, Max would wake up in a panic, his body trembling as if he had been jolted from a nightmare. Other times, he would pace restlessly around the house, unable to settle. But Sophie never wavered. Whenever he seemed distressed, she was there. If he flinched at a sudden noise, she would kneel beside him and whisper reassurances. If he hesitated before entering a room, she would go first and wait for him to follow. Her patience was unwavering, her love unconditional. The first sign of trust. Then, one day, a breakthrough happened. Sophie was playing outside in the yard, tossing a small ball back and forth between her hands. She wasn't even trying to engage Max. She knew he didn't play like other dogs. But then, out of nowhere, he stood up, walked toward her, and gently nudged her with his nose. Sophie blinked in surprise. "What is it, boy?" Max wagged his tail ever so slightly and nudged the ball with his nose. Sophie's heart leaped. "You want to play?" she asked excitedly. Carefully, she tossed the ball a short distance away. For a moment, Max just stood there. Then, slowly, he trotted after it, picked it up in his mouth, and carried it back to her. Rachel and Daniel, who had been watching from the porch, exchanged astonished looks. "He actually played," Daniel murmured, a smile creeping onto his face. Rachel exhaled in disbelief. "I think he's starting to trust us." Sophie giggled as Max nudged the ball toward her again. "You're getting there, Max," she whispered, beaming with joy. For the first time since he had entered their home, Max was beginning to believe, maybe, just maybe, this was where he truly belonged. Scene 4. Seeking help and rebuilding trust. Max had made significant progress since Sophie and her family had rescued him from the market, but it was becoming clear that his past trauma was deeply ingrained. While he had started to trust Sophie and even engaged in small moments of play, his reactions to loud noises, sudden movements, and unfamiliar adults were still unpredictable. One evening, as the family sat in the living room watching a movie, Rachel reached down to pet Max. Without warning, he flinched and cowered, pressing himself against the floor as if expecting to be hit. Rachel pulled her hand back immediately, her heart aching at the sight. "He still thinks someone is going to hurt him," she murmured. Daniel sighed. "We've given him love and patience, but maybe he needs more than that. Maybe we should bring in a professional." Sophie looked up, concern flashing in her big, innocent eyes. "A professional?" Rachel nodded. "Someone who understands dogs like Max, someone who can help him feel safe again. Calling in an expert. The next day, Rachel reached out to a local animal behaviorist, Dr. Louise Taylor, who specialized in rehabilitating traumatized dogs. When Dr. Taylor arrived at their home, Max immediately stiffened, his body tense as he eyed the unfamiliar man warily. Dr. Taylor observed Max from a distance before kneeling and extending his hand in a non-threatening manner. "He's been through a lot, hasn't he said gently. Sophie nodded, stroking Max's back reassuringly. "He's scared of loud noises, sudden movements, and people he doesn't know." Dr. Taylor smiled warmly. "That's understandable. Dogs who have experienced neglect or abuse often develop deep-rooted fears. But the good news is, he's not broken. He just needs time and structured guidance to feel safe again." Understanding Max's trauma. Dr. Taylor spent the next hour evaluating Max's behavior. He tested his reactions to different stimuli, noting how he responded to gentle touch versus sudden motion. When Daniel reached toward Max, the dog instinctively took a step back, his ears flat against his head. Dr. Taylor nodded knowingly. "He's particularly wary of men. This suggests that someone, most likely a male, mistreated him in the past. He associates certain behaviors with pain or fear." Daniel frowned, his expression troubled. "I don't want him to be scared of me forever." "You don't have to force anything," Dr. Taylor reassured him. "Trust isn't built overnight, but with time, patience, and the right approach, he'll learn that you're not a threat." Creating a training plan. Dr. Taylor outlined a training plan tailored to Max's specific needs. Positive reinforcement. Max needed to associate people with good experiences. Whenever he displayed calm behavior around Rachel, Daniel, or any new guests, he would be rewarded with praise, treats, or affection. Gradual desensitization. Instead of overwhelming Max with too much change at once, the family would introduce him to new experiences slowly. Loud noises would be introduced in a controlled manner, helping him understand that they were not a threat. Confidence-building activities, games like fetch, puzzle toys, and obedience training would help Max gain confidence and feel more in control of his environment. Building trust with Daniel. Since Max was particularly fearful of men, Daniel was advised to spend quiet, non-confrontational time near Max, sitting near him without making direct eye contact, offering treats, and allowing Max to approach on his own terms. "This won't be a quick fix," Dr. Taylor warned. "Some days he'll show improvement, and other days he might regress, but the most important thing is consistency." Sophie was determined. "We'll help him no matter how long it takes." The first steps toward healing. The family immediately began implementing Dr. Taylor's recommendations. Daniel started spending more time in the same room as Max without forcing interaction. He would sit on the floor, reading a book or quietly watching TV, occasionally placing a treat nearby. At first, Max kept his distance, but after a few days, curiosity got the better of him. One evening, he cautiously approached Daniel and sniffed his outstretched hand. Daniel held his breath, letting Max take the lead. When Max didn't immediately retreat, he gently placed a treat on the floor. Max hesitated, but then took it, chewing slowly. Rachel, who had been watching from across the room, smiled. "That's progress." Overcoming fear. One of the biggest challenges was helping Max overcome his fear of loud noises. Dr. Taylor suggested playing calming music at a low volume while gradually introducing controlled sounds, like gently tapping a book against a table, so Max could get used to them in a safe environment. The first few days were difficult. Even small noises made him freeze or retreat. But with time, he learned that not every sound signaled danger. One afternoon, Sophie was playing with blocks on the floor. When one toppled over with a clunk, Max flinched but didn't run. Instead, he looked toward Sophie, who smiled and held out a treat. "You're okay, Max," she said softly. Slowly, he stepped forward and took the treat from her palm. The first signs of playfulness. As the weeks passed, Max started to show glimpses of the happy, playful dog he was meant to be. One morning, Sophie woke up to find Max waiting outside her bedroom door. His tail wagged when he saw her, and he followed her down the hallway. That day, when she tossed a small ball across the yard, Max didn't just watch, he actually ran after it. Rachel gasped. "Did he just—" "He chased the ball," Sophie squealed in delight. Max trotted back, dropping the ball at Sophie's feet. She laughed and threw it again. This time, Max sprinted after it, his tail wagging like a flag. Daniel grinned. "That's the happiest I've ever seen him." a setback, and a breakthrough. But healing wasn't linear. One evening, as the family sat outside enjoying dinner, a neighbor's motorcycle revved loudly. Max's entire body tensed, and before anyone could react, he bolted into the house, hiding under the table. Sophie rushed inside, her heart pounding. Max? He was curled up in a tight ball, shaking. Sophie knelt beside him and spoke in a calm, soothing voice. "It's okay, Max. You're safe." She didn't try to pull him out or force him to move. She just sat with him, waiting. Minutes passed. Then slowly, Max stretched his nose forward and nudged her hand. Rachel and Daniel stood in the doorway, watching. "That's trust," Rachel whispered. "A new beginning." Though there were still hurdles ahead, Max was no longer the fearful dog Sophie had first met at the market. He had a family now, a family that loved him unconditionally. And every day, little by little, he was learning that he truly belonged. Scene 5, a growing friendship and the first signs of joy. Time had become a quiet healer for Max. The once fearful and withdrawn dog was slowly emerging from the shadows of his past, guided by Sophie's unwavering patience and love. Though he still flinched at sudden noises and hesitated around strangers, there was something different about him now, a spark of hope in his eyes. One morning, as Sophie sat on the living room floor drawing, Max wandered over and settled beside her. He had been doing this more often, choosing to be close to her rather than hiding in corners. She smiled, reaching out to scratch behind his ears, and to her delight, Max leaned into her touch. "You're getting braver, Max," she whispered, stroking his soft fur. Her parents, Rachel and Daniel, watched from the kitchen. Rachel nudged Daniel, her voice soft. "Look at them. He trusts her completely now." Daniel nodded. "She's been the best thing for him." The first real playtime. That afternoon, Sophie grabbed her favorite red ball and ran outside to the backyard. Max followed at a slow but steady pace, watching as she bounced the ball against the ground. "Want to play, Max?" she asked, holding the ball up. Max cocked his head, curious but hesitant. Sophie tossed the ball a few feet away. Max's ears perked up, but he didn't move. "That's okay," she said, picking up the ball again. She threw it a little farther this time. Maybe next time. And then, Max took a step forward. Sophie held her breath. Another step, then another. Finally, he trotted toward the ball, sniffed it, and, to everyone's surprise, picked it up in his mouth. Sophie gasped in delight. "You did it, Max." Max turned toward her, his tail wagging, not just a small twitch, but a real wag of excitement. He trotted back and dropped the ball at her feet. Rachel and Daniel, watching from the porch, exchanged wide-eyed glances. "Did he just play fetch?" Rachel whispered. Daniel grinned. "Looks like he's finally learning to have fun." Sophie tossed the ball again, and this time, Max ran after it with enthusiasm. Laughter rang through the yard as they played for the first time, not just as a rescued dog and his caretaker, but as true friends. A protective instinct awakens. Max's bond with Sophie was strengthening every day. Wherever she went, he followed. When she sat on the couch, he curled up beside her. When she went to bed, he lay at her doorway, standing guard. One evening, while Rachel was making dinner, Sophie was in the backyard drawing in the grass. Max lay beside her, eyes half closed in contentment. Suddenly, a stray cat darted across the yard, chased by a neighbor's dog. The unexpected commotion startled Max. His ears shot up, and in an instant, he leaped in front of Sophie, standing protectively between her and the approaching animals. His stance was firm, his tail stiff, and for the first time, he let out a deep, commanding bark, a warning. Rachel and Daniel rushed outside to see what had happened, just in time to see the neighbor's dog retreat. Sophie wrapped her arms around Max. "It's okay, buddy. I'm safe." Max's body relaxed slightly, but he remained alert, watching until the other animals were gone. Daniel knelt beside him, gently patting his head. "Good boy, Max. You're looking out for her, huh?" Rachel exhaled in amazement. He's not just trusting us now, he's protecting her. From that moment on, it was clear. Max wasn't just Sophie's friend. He was her guardian, facing new challenges. Though Max had made significant progress, his healing journey wasn't without obstacles. One day, Rachel invited a friend over, Laura, who had never met Max before. As soon as Laura stepped into the house, Max's body tensed. His tail, which had wagged so freely with Sophie, dropped low. "Hey there, buddy," Laura said gently, extending a hand. But Max backed away, his ears flat against his head. Sophie placed a reassuring hand on his back. It's okay, Max. She's a friend. Max didn't growl or act aggressively, but the tension in his posture was unmistakable. Rachel sighed. He still struggles with new people. Laura nodded understandingly. It's okay. He's come a long way, hasn't he? Sophie sat beside Max and whispered, You're safe, Max. No one will hurt you again. After a few minutes, Max took a hesitant step forward. He sniffed the air, then cautiously approached Laura's outstretched hand. Laura stayed perfectly still, letting him come to her at his own pace. When he finally allowed her to scratch behind his ear, Sophie grinned. See, Max? You're doing great. Rachel smiled. He's learning. Slowly, but he's getting there. A heartwarming realization. One night, after Sophie had gone to bed, Rachel and Daniel sat together in the living room, watching Max rest by the fireplace. He's changed so much, Daniel murmured. Rachel nodded. A few weeks ago, he barely trusted us. Now, he plays, he protects Sophie. He's a completely different dog. Daniel chuckled. Well, maybe not completely different. He's still a little stubborn. Rachel laughed. But he's our stubborn dog now. Daniel leaned back in his chair, watching as Max let out a peaceful sigh in his sleep. I think he finally knows he belongs here. And for the first time since they had brought him home, there was no doubt in their minds. Max wasn't just a rescue dog anymore. He was family. Scene 6, a test of loyalty. The warm glow of a Saturday afternoon bathed the backyard in golden light. Sophie laughed as she tossed a small blue ball across the grass. Max, his tail wagging like a flag, dashed after it with newfound confidence. His large paws thudded against the ground as he scooped up the ball and proudly trotted back to Sophie, dropping it at her feet. You're getting so fast, Max, she giggled, ruffling his thick fur. Rachel and Daniel watched from the porch, sipping their iced tea. It had become their favorite weekend tradition, watching their daughter and her once fearful dog grow together. Max had transformed from a neglected, uncertain dog into a loyal companion who never left Sophie's side. He's come so far, Rachel murmured. Daniel nodded, smiling. I never thought I'd see him this happy. But that peaceful afternoon was about to take a terrifying turn. An unexpected danger. A loud bang shattered the tranquility. The neighbor's old truck backfired, sending a sharp, unexpected noise echoing through the street. Max froze. His ears twitched, and for a moment it seemed like he might retreat back into his fearful past. But instead of cowering, his eyes darted to Sophie. His focus wasn't on himself, but on her. Then, before anyone could react, a blur of fur shot across the yard. A stray cat, startled by the noise, darted in front of Sophie. Max, his protective instincts suddenly on high alert, bolted after it. Sophie, thinking Max was simply playing, laughed and ran after him. Wait, Max, come back! But in her excitement, she didn't see the real danger. From the street, a car was approaching. Fast. A hero's decision. Rachel and Daniel's hearts leapt into their throats as they saw Sophie running straight toward the road, oblivious to the oncoming vehicle. Sophie, stop! Rachel screamed. Daniel was already sprinting forward, but it was too late. Sophie was just inches away from stepping onto the street. And that's when Max made his choice. Just as Sophie's foot hit the pavement, Max lunged forward with incredible speed. His powerful body crashed into hers, sending her tumbling backward onto the grass, away from the speeding car. Tires screeched. The driver slammed on the brakes, the car skidding to a stop just a few feet ahead. For a moment, there was absolute silence. Then Rachel and Daniel were rushing to their daughter, their voices thick with panic. Sophie, are you okay? Dazed but unharmed, Sophie sat up, her small hands gripping Max's fur. Her breath was shaky, her wide eyes filled with shock. Max, he pushed me, she whispered. He saved me. Daniel pulled her into a hug, his hands shaking. Rachel knelt beside Max, who was panting heavily but otherwise unharmed. His golden brown eyes remained locked on Sophie, as if making sure she was truly safe. Good boy, Rachel choked out, wrapping her arms around him. You saved her, Max. A newfound understanding. The driver, pale and shaken, stumbled out of the car. I didn't see her, he stammered. I swear, I didn't see her. It's okay, Daniel said, his voice tight with emotion. She's okay, thanks to Max. The news spread quickly. Neighbors came out of their homes, murmuring in awe at what had just happened. He really pushed her out of the way? That dog's a hero. Sophie buried her face in Max's fur, tears spilling onto his coat. You saved my life, she whispered. I love you so much, Max. For the first time, Max licked her cheek in response, his tail wagging gently. And just like that, any doubt about where he belonged disappeared forever. A deeper bond. That night, after the adrenaline had worn off, Sophie lay in bed with Max curled up beside her. "You're my best friend, Max," she murmured sleepily, stroking his fur, "and my protector." Max let out a soft huff, pressing his nose against her arm. Rachel and Daniel stood in the doorway, watching. "He chose her," Daniel whispered. Rachel smiled. "And we chose him." The once neglected dog, who had been discarded as worthless, had just proven his worth in the most extraordinary way, and from that day on, no one ever doubted that Max was truly part of the family. Scene 7. A shadow from the past days passed since Max's heroic act, but the memory of that moment lingered in the hearts of Sophie and her family. Max, once a fearful and uncertain dog, had proven his devotion in the most extraordinary way by saving Sophie's life. His bond with her had grown even stronger, and wherever Sophie went, Max followed. He was no longer just a pet. He was her guardian, her best friend, her hero. But just when it seemed like Max had finally found his forever home, an unexpected threat reappeared from the past, his former owner. An uneasy encounter. One crisp autumn afternoon, Rachel and Sophie took Max for a walk at the park. The golden leaves crunched under their feet as Sophie laughed, running ahead with Max, trotting beside her, his tail wagging. Everything felt perfect until a familiar voice cut through the air. Well, I was wondering where you ended up." Rachel turned toward the voice, her heart immediately tightening. Standing a few feet away was Mr. Blake, the cruel vendor from the market who had once neglected Max. Max froze, his body stiffening as his ears pinned back. Sophie instinctively gripped his leash tighter. "Who is he, Mommy?" Rachel took a steady breath. "He's the man who used to own Max." Blake's eyes narrowed as he took a step forward, his gaze locked on Max. "So that's where you ran off to," he muttered, voice dripping with disdain. "Guess you're doing all right for yourself." Max let out a low, warning growl. He didn't move from Sophie's side, but his stance had changed. He was no longer a frightened dog trying to escape. He was protecting his family. Blake chuckled darkly. "Didn't think he'd turn out so useful, huh?" His gaze flicked to Rachel. "You stole my dog." Rachel squared her shoulders. "We didn't steal him. You gave him away because you didn't care about him, and we took care of him when you wouldn't." Blake scoffed. "I changed my mind," he smirked, "and I want him back." Sophie stands her ground. At Blake's words, Sophie immediately stepped forward. Though she was small, the fire in her eyes made her seem much bigger. "You don't deserve him," she said firmly. "You treated him badly. He was sad and lonely because of you." Blake's expression darkened. "Listen, kid, he was my dog first." "No, he wasn't," Sophie shot back. "He was never yours. You never loved him." Max let out another growl, stepping in front of Sophie, his body tense. Rachel placed a protective hand on Sophie's shoulder. "We have vet records, adoption paperwork, and proof of the condition Max was in when we got him. If you try to take him, you won't get far." Blake's smirk faltered for a second before his face twisted with annoyance. "You think a piece of paper means anything? He was mine, and I can prove it." Rachel's patience snapped. "If you really cared about Max, why did you leave him tied up, neglected, and unloved? Why was he skin and bones when we found him?" For the first time, Blake looked uneasy. He glanced around, realizing that other people in the park were watching the scene unfold. Some had overheard the conversation, and a few parents were pulling their children closer, glaring at him. Rachel crossed her arms. "If you try to take him, we'll take legal action." Blake clenched his jaw, looking at Max with resentment. "Fine, keep your mutt." And with that, he turned and stalked off, muttering under his breath. A lasting fear. Even after Blake was gone, Rachel could feel Sophie trembling beside her. "He's not coming back, is he?" Sophie asked, her voice small. Rachel knelt beside her and held her close. "We won't let him take Max, sweetheart. I promise." Max, sensing Sophie's distress, nudged her with his nose and licked her hand gently. Sophie sniffled and hugged him. "You're safe with us, Max. No one's ever taking you away." Max licked her cheek in response. But even as they walked home, Rachel couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that this wasn't over. Scene 8. A new chapter at the pet fair. Despite the unsettling encounter with Mr. Blake, Sophie's family refused to let fear dictate their lives. They took extra precautions, ensuring Max was always with them and never left unattended, but they refused to let the past overshadow the new life they had built together. So when Sophie heard about the annual pet fair and dog show coming to their town, she knew it was the perfect opportunity to show the world how far Max had come. Excitement and anticipation. "Mom, Dad, can we take Max to the pet fair?" Sophie asked excitedly one morning, holding up a brightly colored flyer. Rachel skimmed the details. "It's an event for pet owners to show off their dog's skills and meet trainers. There's even a small agility competition." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "Agility? Max has never tried anything like that. But he's fast and smart," Sophie argued. "Please, it'll be fun, and Max will love it." Rachel smiled. "I think it's a great idea. It'll be good for Max to be around new people in a safe, friendly environment." Daniel nodded. "All right, let's do it." Sophie beamed, hugging Max tightly. "We're going to have so much fun, buddy." Max wagged his tail, sensing her excitement, though he had no idea what adventure awaited him. A busy, bustling event. The day of the fair arrived, and as soon as Sophie and her family stepped into the park, they were greeted by the lively sounds of barking dogs, cheerful chatter, and music playing over loudspeakers. Booths lined the area, selling pet supplies, treats, and adoption services. Dogs of every size and breed ran around with their owners, some practicing tricks, others competing in obstacle courses. Sophie's eyes sparkled with excitement as she took in the scene. "This is amazing," she exclaimed. Max, on the other hand, was more cautious. His ears flicked at the unfamiliar sounds, and his nose twitched as he took in the scents of dozens of other dogs. He stayed close to Sophie, his body tense but alert. Rachel knelt beside him. "It's okay, Max. Just take your time." Sophie reached for his leash, giving it a reassuring tug. "Come on, boy. Let's have fun." Slowly but surely, Max started to relax. He sniffed the air, wagged his tail at a passing Labrador, and even accepted a treat from a friendly vendor. For the first time since his rescue, he was stepping out of his comfort zone, and he was enjoying it. A hidden talent revealed. As they walked through the fair, Sophie's attention was drawn to a large agility course set up in the center of the event. There were jumps, tunnels, and weaving poles, with excited dogs eagerly racing through them. "Can we try?" she asked eagerly. Daniel hesitated. "Sophie, Max has never done agility before." "But he's fast and smart," she insisted. "Just one try?" Rachel chuckled. "All right, let's see if he's interested." They approached the registration booth, where a kind-faced instructor smiled at them. "Would you like to test your dog's agility skills?" "Yes, please," Sophie said enthusiastically. The instructor handed her a small ball. "Start by leading him over the first jump with this. If he seems comfortable, guide him through the course." Sophie knelt beside Max. "Okay, buddy, let's try something new." She tossed the ball gently over the first hurdle. Max watched it, his ears perking up. For a moment he hesitated. Then, with surprising grace and determination, he bounded over the hurdle, chasing after the ball. A collective gasp of surprise rippled through the small crowd. Sophie's face lit up with joy. "You did it, Max." The instructor nodded approvingly. "He's a natural. Try the next one." Sophie led Max through the weaving poles, then toward a tunnel. Each time, he followed with increasing confidence. By the end of the run, the small audience was clapping and cheering. "That was incredible," the instructor said. "Have you considered agility training for him?" Rachel and Daniel exchanged a look. "Not until now," Daniel admitted. The instructor handed Sophie a flyer. "He's got real potential. If you're interested, our club offers training classes." Sophie beamed. "Max, you're amazing," Max panted happily, his tail wagging wildly. For the first time, he wasn't just a rescue dog. He was a star, a familiar face in the crowd. As they celebrated, Rachel suddenly noticed a figure standing near the edge of the crowd, watching them intently. Her heart stopped. It was Mr. Blake. His expression was unreadable as he stared at Max, then at Sophie, then back at the dog. It was clear he hadn't expected to see them here. Rachel's grip on Sophie's shoulder tightened. "Stay close, sweetheart." Sophie followed her mother's gaze and saw him. Her stomach twisted. "Why is he here?" "I don't know," Rachel murmured. Blake didn't move. He simply stood there, watching, his expression unreadable. Then, without a word, he turned and walked away. Rachel let out a slow breath, but unease settled in her chest. "Let's keep an eye out," Daniel said grimly. "I don't trust him." A new path forward. Despite the unsettling moment, the fair was a huge success for Max. He had proven his courage, discovered a new talent, and had taken another step toward fully embracing his new life. That night, as they walked home, Sophie held onto Max's leash proudly. "You were amazing today," she told him. "I think you found something you love." Max nuzzled her hand in response, his tail wagging. Rachel and Daniel smiled at each other. Maybe agility training is in his future after all, Rachel mused. Daniel chuckled. "I think he's already made up his mind." And as they walked toward their home, Max's ears twitched, as if he could sense that his journey wasn't over yet. Scene 9. A battle for Max. The excitement of the pet fair and agility competition had given Max a new sense of purpose. He had gone from a neglected, fearful dog to a confident and agile companion, and Sophie couldn't have been prouder. But the joy from that day was short-lived, as a dark shadow loomed over them. Max's past was coming back to haunt him. After seeing Mr. Blake at the event, Rachel and Daniel had a feeling he wouldn't let things go so easily. Their suspicions were confirmed just a few days later when a formal letter arrived in the mail, one that sent a chill through the entire family. It was a legal notice. Blake was trying to reclaim Max. The claim of ownership. Rachel read the letter out loud, her voice shaking with frustration. Mr. Blake has formally petitioned to regain custody of his property, a German Shepherd previously known as Rex. He claims the dog was taken from him under false pretenses and is requesting legal intervention to return him to his original owner. Sophie's heart dropped. Property? Max isn't property. He's family. Daniel clenched his jaw. I knew that man would try something like this. Rachel exhaled, placing the letter on the table. He's making it sound like we stole Max, but we didn't. He gave him up willingly. Sophie threw her arms around Max's neck, tears welling in her eyes. They can't take him away, right? Tell me they can't. Daniel placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. We're going to fight this. Max belongs with us. Gathering evidence. Determined to stop Blake from taking Max, Rachel and Daniel contacted an animal rights lawyer, Miss Patterson, who specialized in cases like theirs. You have a strong case, Miss Patterson assured them during their consultation. We just need to prove that Max was neglected and that he's thriving in your care. Rachel and Daniel immediately got to work. They compiled vet records, showing Max's poor health when they first took him in, his malnourishment, his fleas, and the stress he had endured. They gathered testimony from neighbors, friends, and trainers who had witnessed Max's transformation firsthand. They printed out photos, before and after shots that clearly showed how much healthier and happier Max had become. And the most powerful piece of evidence? Sophie herself. I want to write something, she said one evening, determination in her voice. I want the judge to know how much Max means to me. With a pencil in hand, she carefully wrote a heartfelt letter. Dear Judge, my name is Sophie, and Max is my best friend. When we found him, he was scared and sad. He didn't trust anyone, but now he plays with me, cuddles with me, and protects me. He saved my life. He loves us, and we love him. Please don't let someone who didn't care about him take him away. He belongs with his family. He belongs with me. Rachel wiped a tear from her cheek as she read it. That's beautiful, sweetheart. Sophie looked down at Max, who rested his head on her lap. I won't let anyone take you away, she whispered. The courtroom showdown. The day of the hearing arrived, and the tension in the courtroom was heavy. Sophie, clutching Max's leash, sat beside her parents as they faced Mr. Blake across the room. Blake sat smugly, his lawyer beside him. That dog belongs to me, he said, his voice cold. These people took him without my consent. Miss Patterson stood. Your Honor, we have evidence that Mr. Blake neglected and mistreated Max. He willingly gave him up, and since being with the Jacobs family, Max has flourished. She presented photos, medical records, and witness testimonies. Blake's lawyer tried to argue, but the evidence was undeniable. Then came the final moment. Sophie's letter was read aloud. The courtroom fell silent. Even the judge looked moved as Sophie's words echoed through the room. Blake's expression darkened. He had no real defense. After reviewing all the evidence, the judge finally spoke. The court rules in favor of the Jacobs family. Max will remain in their care permanently. A victory for Max. Sophie burst into happy tears, hugging Max tightly. We did it, buddy. You're safe. Rachel and Daniel sighed in relief as Blake stormed out of the courtroom, defeated. Miss Patterson smiled. Congratulations, Max is officially and legally yours. As they left the courthouse, Max wagged his tail excitedly, as if he knew, in his own way, that he was finally, truly home. Scene 10. Justice served and a new beginning. The relief that washed over Sophie's family after winning the court case was indescribable. Max was finally, legally, and permanently part of their family. No one, especially Mr. Blake, could ever take him away. But just as they were ready to move forward, the judge's final words in the courtroom still echoed in their minds. Given the concerning allegations of neglect and mistreatment, this court is ordering an investigation into Mr. Blake's past ownership of animals. What came next was something no one expected. Uncovering the truth within days of the trial, authorities launched an official animal welfare investigation into Mr. Blake. Witnesses from the marketplace, neighbors, and even former customers who had interacted with him came forward with horrifying testimonies. It turned out Max wasn't the only dog Blake had mistreated. A local news article reported, several cases of animal neglect have been uncovered in connection to vendor Harold Blake, known for keeping dogs in unsanitary and unsafe conditions. Reports indicate he has abandoned multiple animals over the years, treating them as disposable property rather than living beings. Rachel read the article aloud, shaking her head in disbelief. I knew he was cruel, but this... Sophie held Max close, burying her face in his fur. I'm so glad we saved you, Max. The community takes a stand. News of Blake's mistreatment of animals spread quickly. The community, already angered by his attempt to take Max away, rallied together to ensure he would never be able to harm another dog again. Animal rights groups stepped in, demanding that authorities ban Blake from owning pets for life. Neighbors who had witnessed his treatment of animals shared evidence with local authorities. The market where he had kept Max announced that Blake was permanently banned from selling animals there. When the investigation concluded, Mr. Blake faced criminal charges for animal cruelty. Sophie overheard her parents discussing the news late one night. He's being held accountable, Rachel said. It won't undo what he did, but at least he won't be able to hurt another dog. Daniel nodded. It's justice. Not just for Max, but for every animal he's harmed. Max's story goes public. As Blake's downfall became a major local news story, so did Max's incredible journey. A journalist from an animal welfare magazine reached out, wanting to feature Sophie and Max's story. One evening, the family sat in their living room as the journalist, Miss Carter, interviewed them. Max lay at Sophie's feet, his eyes full of calm trust. So, Sophie, Miss Carter said with a smile, tell me, how did you know Max was special? Sophie scratched behind Max's ears. Because he needed someone to love him, and because he loved me back. Miss Carter chuckled. And how does it feel knowing you helped change his life? Sophie beamed. Max changed my life too. He's my best friend. By the time the article was published, Max had become a symbol of resilience and love. His story inspired families to adopt rescue dogs, and donations poured into local shelters. Rachel smiled as she scrolled through the comments online. People are really touched by Max's journey. Sophie hugged Max tightly. That's because he's amazing. Max wagged his tail in agreement. A future of possibilities. With the legal battle behind them, Sophie and Max could finally focus on the future. One day, as they walked through the park, Sophie noticed a flyer pinned to a notice board. Annual Agility Championship open for entries. She gasped and turned to her parents. Can Max enter? Rachel read through the details. He has been training and he loves it. Daniel grinned. Why not? Let's give it a shot. Sophie jumped up and down. Max, we're going to compete. Max barked happily, as if he understood. A happy ending and a new beginning. As the sun set on their journey, one thing was clear. Max had found his forever home. He was no longer just a rescue dog. He was a protector, a champion, and a beloved family member. And for Sophie, life would never be the same without him. As she curled up in bed that night, Max by her side, she whispered, I love you, Max. And in response, Max let out a content sigh, knowing he was exactly where he was meant to be. Forever.